Hello and welcome. You are listening to Pint-Sized Therapy, where we explore all things related to mental health healing, personal growth and development, emotional wellness, and the human experience in pint-sized bites. I am your host, Dr. Aletha Clark, a licensed psychotherapist, certified hypnotherapist, and master addiction counselor, and I am happy to have you here with me today as you embark on your mental wellness journey. While I appreciate you tuning in, don't forget this podcast is informational only and is not a substitute for seeking out your own mental health counseling with a licensed professional. So join me as we jump into today's episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Pint-Sized Therapy. Today, I want to introduce you to a term that's been living in my mind for a while now, one that emerged from my clinical work as well as my personal observations, and I call it radical accommodation. Now, if you're thinking that, this just sounds like extreme people-pleasing, you're not totally wrong, but radical accommodation goes even deeper. It's usually a survival strategy. It's a behavioral pattern that often stems from pain, insecurity, and a profound fear of not being loved or accepted. And I want to talk about it today because I know so many of you listening may recognize yourselves in what I'm about to share. And I see you, not with judgment, but with compassion. Because unlearning this pattern can be hard, but it's also where your healing will begin. So in my clinical work, I have come into contact with individuals who come into therapy deeply burnt out. On the outside, they may look like someone who has it all together. They're the go-to friend, the go-to person, the dependable child or sibling, the helpful coworker. They're always available. They're always smiling. They're always accommodating. But under that surface, they're exhausted. They can't say no. They would cancel their own appointments, skip meals, and rearrange their entire schedule just to be there for someone else. And it wasn't because they had time or even capacity. It was because they felt they had to. They were terrified of disappointing people, terrified of being seen as selfish, terrified of being left out or unloved, terrified of being rejected and not accepted. That's what radical accommodation looks like. It's not just people-pleasing. It's a self-erasure in the name of connection. It's sacrificing your physical, emotional, and mental needs to secure belonging or even avoid abandonment. So, what is radical accommodation? So, I'd like to kind of break it down for you. First, we're going to start off with talking about people-pleasing. People-pleasing is when you say yes to keep the peace. You may go along with things you don't agree with just to avoid conflict. You don't want to rock the boat. But radical accommodation, on the other hand, it's more obsessive and compulsive. It's when you're driven by an inner urgency to accommodate, to anticipate other people's needs before they ask, to fix them, to rescue, to rearrange your life constantly for others. Often you don't even realize you're doing it until you're emotionally depleted or deeply resentful. Radical accommodation can look like feeling responsible for other people's emotions, experiencing guilt anytime you can't do something, constantly asking yourself, did I do something wrong? Feeling anxious or panicked when someone is disappointed in you, abandoning your own needs without hesitation to accommodate somebody else, and equating love with being useful or needed. Radical accommodation is that feeling of responsibility to take care of everything, even when you know you do not have the time, the emotional bandwidth, nor the energy to get it done. It's the guilt you feel when you cannot do something, or the fear of potential repercussions if you say no. It's the willingness to sacrifice your own needs to accommodate others. So you might wonder where this comes from. Often radical accommodation is learned early. Maybe you grew up in a home where love was conditional, where you were made to feel responsible for keeping the peace, to be the provider or caretaker at a young age. You may have been neglected emotionally, so you tried to earn attention by being helpful or staying quiet, staying hidden or out the way. You could have been bullied or even belittled, learned to survive by blending in or even over functioning. Or you were in relationships where you were blamed for everything and tried to fix things so you wouldn't be left or abandoned. This behavior becomes a coping strategy. It's a way to get connection in environments where your needs didn't matter. It's not just about being nice, it's about survival, about belonging. According to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this reminds us that after our basic survival needs are met, our next most pressing need is love and belonging. If love felt unsafe or was tied to performance, obedience, or self-sacrifice, you may have unconsciously started to believe that if I don't accommodate, I won't be loved. If I take up space, I'll be rejected. If I say no, they'll leave. So radical accommodation becomes your strategy to secure safety and connection, to feel that sense of belonging, to avoid abandonment. It's deeply human, but it's also deeply damaging when left unchecked. Now let's talk about the emotional, the psychological, and even physical toll that radical accommodation can take over time. At first glance, it might seem like you're just being helpful or doing what's right. But over the weeks, the months, and years, this pattern chips away at your well-being, your relationships, your sense of self. It can lead to things such as chronic burnout. You're constantly on. You're hyper aware of other people's needs. You're anticipating, you're fixing, you're smoothing things over before they even ask. It's emotionally exhausting. And the thing is, you're not just doing this in one relationship, you're doing it everywhere. You're doing it at work, with family, with friendships and romantic partnerships. You become the go-to person for everyone, and it starts to feel like you can't breathe. Over time, that helplessness is going to turn into quiet bitterness. You may start thinking, why am I always the one bending? Why do they expect so much of me? But then comes the guilt, because how can you be resentful when you're choosing to help? The cognitive dissonance can feel paralyzing. Over time, you might start overanalyzing every interaction. Did I say the right thing? Did they sound disappointed in me? Should I have done more? You may constantly scan people's reactions, trying to make sure they're okay. Because deep down, if they're upset, you start to believe and feel like it's your fault. And when your identity is built around accommodating others, you may struggle to answer simple questions like, what is it that I want? How do I feel? What's my opinion? You spent so long shape-shifting that you've forgotten your own shape. And your sense of value becomes tied to how much you do for others. If you're not being helpful or agreeable, you fear you're unworthy. This can make self-acceptance feel nearly impossible without some type of external validation. Radical accommodation attracts people who take. So friends or partners may begin to expect you to carry the emotional load, never really reciprocating it. You may even fear that if you stop accommodating, the relationship will collapse. And often it does. And that's painful, but it's also clarifying. You may actually start to feel a need to be needed, but you're not actually being seen. Your relationship becomes transactional, built on usefulness instead of authenticity. And that keeps you stuck in a cycle of emotional caretaking. You're always helping, giving. And the other relationships around you that you surround yourself with, are constantly taking. And when you override your own needs long enough, your body keeps that score. You may start to experience sleep disturbances, muscle tension, digestive issues, and even migraines. The stress of constant self-abandonment becomes somatic. You might be listening to this and thinking, that's me, or I do that. And it's okay. It's okay if you recognize this in yourself. This is not a character flaw. It's an adaptation. It's a survival response from a time in your life when being small, helpful, or invisible felt safer than being fully human, fully present, fully authentic. But now that you know, you have the power to choose differently, to honor your limits, to reclaim your voice, to trust that you are lovable even when you're not accommodating other people. So how do you begin? The good news is that it isn't who you are, it's something you actually learned. And what's learned can be unlearned. So here are some ways to begin healing. Begin with challenging those beliefs. Challenge the belief that saying no equals rejection. Try replacing, if I say no, they'll hate me, with people who truly care about me, respect my boundaries, and do not always expect me to accommodate their every need. Practice self-talk that affirms your worth, even when you disappoint someone. Notice where you hold the tension that you feel when you're about to say no or speak up. Breathe deeply and name that sensation. Try grounding techniques like pressing your feet into the floor or placing a hand over your heart. Begin with small boundaries, declining an invitation, asking for what you actually need, or saying, I'll get back to you, or practice saying no. Surround yourself with people who don't punish you for having your own needs. And write it out. Ask yourself, what would I do differently if I didn't fear being unloved? Or if I didn't fear being abandoned? Where did I learn that my worth is tied to how much I do for other people? Healing from radical accommodation is about reclaiming your space in the world. It's about unlearning that your value comes from being flexible or self-sacrificing and always accommodating. It's about learning to belong to yourself first and recognizing that the people who truly love you will never require your self-abandonment in exchange for connection, belonging. And listen, this isn't a sense of being selfish. It's about becoming whole and honoring your own needs. And you deserve to be whole. So I hope that you take a moment to pause and reflect. This isn't easy work, but it's courageous. And every time you choose yourself, even in small ways, you are breaking a generational pattern. You're healing. So until next time, I want you to be kind to yourself. Speak gently to your needs. And remember, you don't have to radically accommodate. You don't have to earn love. You are already enough. As always, thank you for joining me today on Pint-Sized Therapy. If you found this conversation meaningful, I invite you to leave me a comment, like, subscribe, and share with your family and friends. Come visit my website at pint-sizedtherapy.com and my Etsy shop at pint-sizedtherapy.etsy.com, where you will find resources to accompany our various discussions and encourage you to continue your wellness journey. Once again, I am Dr. Aletha Clark. Until next time, remember to protect your peace and take care of your mental health.